Today I'm going to be talking about the short story The Medicine Bag by Virginia Driving-Hawk Sneeve. Virginia is an award-winning author who mainly focuses on children's books and short stories. She grew up on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota as a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. In the story, the main character, Martin, talks about how every year his family would go to South Dakota to visit grandfather at the reservation. When he would come back, he would show his friends things he got, such as a hand drum or a pair of moccasins his grandfather made, and he would tell them stories. Despite this, Martin doesn't want his friends to ever meet his grandfather, as he doesn't match stereotypical depictions and might embarrass him. Martin straight out says that his friends only are really familiar with Indians from movies and TV shows, and because of that, they were impressed by the stories he told them. One day, while making breakfast, Martin hears a big commotion in the street. He goes out and sees a crowd of dogs and kids surrounding a man who is walking down the middle of the street. Martin is appalled to realize the man is his grandfather, wearing a hat with a feather and a beaded red shirt. Martin embarrassedly ushers his grandfather into the house, where his grandfather promptly faints from heat stroke. They remove his hat and his boots and put him in bed, and realize his boots have been stuffed full of money. When grandfather awakes, he explains that he got lonely after they left after their most recent visit, and he rode a bus for nearly 2 days straight to visit them. The reason he was walking down the middle of the street is he couldn't see the street numbers on the houses clearly from the sidewalk, and the money in his boots is money he has saved up for his funeral. He brought it as he knows he is dying, and he has to pass the medicine bag to Martin. Despite Martin's younger sister constantly bringing her friends around to meet grandfather while he stays with them, Martin continuously makes excuses around his friends to get them to avoid coming. Although one day they completely ignore his protests and decide to come over. Despite the fact they are kind of mocking grandfather and making a few snide remarks, they are completely in awe of him and treat him with a great deal of respect, calling him sir and sitting at his feet to listen while he tells stories. After they leave, grandfather tells Martin that the next day he will give him the medicine bag, and that night Martin dreams of standing on a hill surrounded by thunder and lightning, and he hears the beat of a drum in the distance. The next day, he meets grandfather in the sitting room with the shades drawn. Grandfather tells him he has sent the rest of the family away, as what you will hear today is only for a man's ears, and what you will receive is only for man's hands. Grandfather then tells him of his father, who would be Martin's great-great-grandfather, as grandfather is actually his great-grandfather. Grandfather's father went on a vision quest early in his life. He took a purifying bath and went up on an isolated hill, where he prayed for 3 days. After the 3 days, he had a sacred dream, where he was led to a white man's iron. He didn't understand this dream, but as he came down the hill, he found the remains of a campsite with a broken kettle. He took a piece of the iron from the kettle and put it in the medicine bag he wore on his neck, and the tribe elders gave him the name Iron Shell. A little later in his life, Iron Shell, as well as many other younger members of the tribe, were taken to a faraway boarding school. While at the boarding school, Iron Shell was sent to work in the school's small blacksmith shop, and he knew the sacred dream had sent him there as he was to learn to work the white man's iron. He became a blacksmith and returned to the reservation, where he married and had a few kids. When he grew older, he gave his eldest son, Martin's grandfather, the medicine pouch. At this point, grandfather begins to sob, and Martin becomes scared as he has never really seen grandfather become super emotional. Grandfather then tells Martin he gave the bag to his son when he was leaving to fight in the war, as he thought the medicine bag would protect him. His son refused to take it as he was scared of losing the bag, and he ended up dying in the war, far from his home. Grandfather then removes the medicine bag from his neck and opens it, removing 2 items. He shows Martin that the items are the shard of iron from the kettle, as well as a pebble from the hill where Iron Shell had his sacred dream. He tips the bag over in the air, spilling out dust that he says is a piece of sacred sage. The next time Martin visits the reservation, he must put the items back in the medicine bag, as well as a new piece of sacred prairie sage, and he must never open the bag until he passes the medicine bag on to his son. That night, Martin's parents took grandfather to the hospital. 2 weeks later, Martin added the sacred sage to the bag and tied it shut. I believe the main theme of this short story, as well as the whole point of it, is the idea of survivance, mainly in the form of the medicine bag itself, which is passed down through generations as a form of tradition. One of the biggest parts of this is, despite the fact that he was sent to a boarding school and forcefully put in a new society, Iron Shell held on to his culture and traditions, keeping the medicine bag with him, and then returning to his reservation as soon as he could. Another big part of the story is the idea of stereotypes. Martin very early on mentions his friends are only familiar with American Indians from stereotypes in TV shows and movies, and he's worried about the fact that Grandfather doesn't match said stereotypes when it comes to his appearance and the way he lives, as Grandfather is not financially well off and lives in a converted trailer, as well as the fact that he is a frail older man with thinning white hair. There's also a line where one of Martin's friends says, "We're going to see the great Indian of Bellevue Drive," kind of insulting the idea of Grandfather being in their town, despite the fact that when he meets Grandfather, he as well as the other friends end up just treating him with a great deal of respect. The third most prevalent theme in the short story, which I also think is one of the most important, is the idea of cultural identity. Martin's family seems to be really in touch with their cultural identity. Martin's mother always makes sure they visit Grandfather at least once a year on the reservation, and while they're there, Grandfather tells them stories and teaches them traditions, as well as giving them gifts relevant to their culture, such as the moccasins he made. He also says that the line, "Even though the boy bears a white man's name, the medicine bag will be his," which this idea, the fact that Martin and his sister have a white father, is touched on a couple times, and it's mainly pointed out that despite the fact their father is white, they are keeping with their traditions, and Grandfather is teaching them about the culture as best as possible. And throughout the short story, their father is incredibly supportive of everything. When Grandfather first appears in the town, Martin's father is the one who tells Grandfather that he will be staying with them and that he's not taking no for an answer, and says it's like no trouble at all. He will be staying with them whether he wants to or not. They'll take care of him while he's there. A big part of the cultural identity themes in the short story is also Martin's embarrassment with his own culture. Despite the fact that he shows off things like the drum and the moccasin and tells his friends stories of the reservation to impress them, he's also incredibly embarrassed by his own culture, as the first thing he feels when he sees Grandfather is embarrassment. He's embarrassed to see his grandfather out where people who know Martin can see him, as the people around are only familiar with American Indians in the form of stereotypes, and he doesn't want them realizing that the stereotypes of them all being like strong warriors and hunters who are in touch with nature and like their culture, he doesn't want them to realize that's not entirely accurate, which is another reason why he just does his absolute best to keep his friends from meeting Grandfather until they eventually just ignore him and go to his house despite what he says. I think the passing of the medicine bag helps Martin with his cultural identity, as the first thing he says he thinks when he's handed it is that he doesn't want to wear it around his neck as he'll be embarrassed to be seen wearing it, which Grandfather seems to know, as he tells him he doesn't need to wear it. But then at the end of the short story, after Grandfather has died and Martin puts the sacred prairie sage into the pouch, he does put it around his neck. So he isn't really as embarrassed by it anymore, and he's more in touch with who he is, which I think is really important to his character. And in conclusion, I just believe this short story is really well written and does a phenomenal job of getting ideas such as survivance and cultural identity across, especially to members who might have little to no experience with anything relating to American Indians. And overall, I think it was just incredibly well made.